Good morning, Delci. How are you?
I am wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. Thank you.
Likewise, it's such a pleasure to talk. And I've had you on my wish list for a long while, but I was also prompted to get in touch when I interviewed your friend, long-term friend and sometime colleague, Elan Abrel, as well, who sort of nudged you to the top of my priority list. It was brilliant to get the chance to add you to our guest list because it sounds like you've had quite a deep impact on his own thinking and his own philosophy too. I think he said you were high school friends. He said she explained to me why she was vegan, and I just decided I have to be vegan, and I did it that day. So that's pretty direct impact. I think
Yeah,
if everybody could have that level of impact with everyone they talk to, I think we could see some pretty rapid change in the world. But I think you're probably two quite special people, shall we say? So
thank you. Yeah, I was really grateful for that shout out. But although as he also said in that same interview, he was primed for it, and I don't think any one event or person can take credit. It's all sort of like accretion of experiences that lead us to shift our viewpoints. But I'm grateful to have had the impact that I did, and to see all the amazing work that's come from him out of it.
well, it's great, very sort of gracious of you not to claim all the credit. I think I would have just taken the whole thing.
I think that's evidence based. So.
Yeah, fair point. Touche. Well, so as you know, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions, the questions of what's real and what's true, how should we understand reality, and just as important, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters, if anything does. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which in a sentence answers those two questions by saying we should commit to using evidence and reason and having compassion for all sentient beings. And I try and keep it pretty minimalistic. I just say that's all it is, and it has radical implications, but the basics are the most important. But I'm lucky enough to talk to a dazzling array of people in these conversations, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'd be great to understand your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now. But before we get on to those big questions and how you answer them, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
So I would say I'm a animal protection lawyer, scholar, teacher, and program builder. And I have done that work in a variety of settings over the years. And currently I am doing it at Vermont Law and Graduate School as an associate professor of law and the director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute, which I created 2 years ago, and is committed to training animal advocacy leaders, and also serving as a resource hub for animal law and policy issues. And so we do that through a number of pathways, but one of the most important is our degree program. So we have both residential and online JD law degree programs where students can concentrate in animal law. We've launched a new Masters of Animal Protection Policy degree, which you might be happy to learn has both science and ethics classes at its core as required courses. We have an LLM degree in animal law that you're actually the first to hear about it because it just was approved. And so that's for folks who already have a law degree, but really want to deepen or shift their focus towards animals. And then also the last component of the program that I'll mention, because I could go on all day about this, is we have a farmed animal advocacy clinic, which is the only program of its kind in the world. And it's a place where students get to do hands-on work on behalf of clients in the animal advocacy space. So they're both doing work contributing to the furtherance of the field and meeting unmet needs, but also learning in the best way possible through experiential learning.
Yeah, it's quite a portfolio. Thank you. Yeah, and congratulations on the new LLM too. And one of the things that comes through clearly is obviously you're working in academia and you've spent most of your career so far working in academia, but there's something about the non-human animal space that I think makes it very hard to be a sort of ivory tower academic, right? There's just such a powerful imperative to get out there and have an impact in the world, and your work's done that to an amazing extent and still is today. So I think we'll probably come on to that as we talk through the topic.
Yeah, and I will say, just to respond to that, my path has been very non-traditional, and I have straddled academia and practice for virtually my whole career. So I had a mentor who somehow decided during my first semester of law school that I was going to be a law professor. And I resisted that very much because law school was a means to an end to me. I'm a pragmatic idealist, and I was here to help animals. So it's been an interesting pathway, and it is very much grounded in on the ground work to this day for animals.
Yeah, making a difference in the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start with the first of these crazily big questions, this sort of what's real epistemology question. And for many of my guests, it's a story about whether they originally grew up in maybe a more religious or spiritual or supernaturally minded sort of context, family and society, or one that was maybe more naturalistic or scientifically minded, maybe atheist, agnostic, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life, if it has. And the question of religion and atheism sort of looms large, but it's not the only aspect of natural, supernatural thinking too. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell the story about how that side of your philosophy has shifted, if it has.
It's interesting for me. So my mom grew up in a fundamentalist, fear-based cult. And so she very much, and she left that cult as a teenager and also had me as a teenager. And so she really didn't want us to experience that. And so we didn't go to church at all. We weren't really a practicing religious family. My dad was agnostic, but she still had very strong religious beliefs herself. And, but she didn't force them on us. And so I grew up pretty much always, I think, in what you would call naturalistic and being critically minded and making decisions based on what I observed in the world. I think I probably have disappointed my mom in that I'm an atheist, but she created the context for me to be able to do that.
Yeah. So, and that sounds like it was, as you said, the context was sort of there already. It presumably felt quite sort of a natural path for you to follow. It doesn't sound like there was any particular trauma or challenge or difficulty in that path. It's just, it's where you are and you're pretty comfortable with it throughout.
Yeah.
But I'm interested, as you looked at, as you grew up and you probably had deeper conversations with your mum on the topic, but also looked at, religious and supernatural thinking that you encountered in the wider world. How did you come to think of the influence of supernatural thinking and religious thinking? There's obviously the difficult context that your mother lived through. There are good and bad aspects of the impact of religious modes of thought. Were they just sort of not really relevant to you? Did you feel like a need to challenge them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Part of it is I think I was just born argumentative. I mean, my mom says from the time I was a toddler, she thought I was going to be a lawyer. And so I was always pushing back and critical and asking questions. But I do think that because of what my mom experienced and growing up with my aunts and uncles always talking about some of the traumas that they experienced growing up in that environment, it gave me a critical lens on religion. And so I think from the outset, or at least pretty early on, I was critical about what's really the agenda here? Who is this serving?
Yeah, that makes sense. And with the guests I've spoken to so far and with myself, often there seems to be a sort of combination of a couple of things going on. One is just the straightforward evidence and reason stuff, which just thinks this doesn't seem likely to be true to me because the evidence isn't strong enough. So that's more of a sort of intellectual path of just saying, I need better evidence to believe this stuff. And the other one, which you are hinting at there, which I'd imagine the sort of wider family experiences, where we're actually seeing some potential harms that don't always, but can come from those modes of thinking, whether it's various forms of discrimination or exclusionary thinking or, overriding the importance of the suffering and lives and deaths of real people and other sentient beings with some sort of higher purpose that can justify harms. There's all sorts of stuff there, but it sounds like it was probably a mix of the two that got you arguing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, I feel like I've always just had a really strong moral compass. And so, it raised questions early on, why would someone in a position of authority create terror or suffering in children in this case? And so I think part of it came with an early anti-authoritarian bent as well, because I felt that it wasn't right to cause people to suffer or to be fearful. And people in positions of power were doing that. And so I was inherently critical and suspicious of religion, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And beyond the scope of religion, are there any other areas of your thinking where you're sort of interested or tempted in the possibility of things beyond the natural world? So some people will move away from a religious worldview or not have one in the first place and become a sort of straightforward, boring naturalist like me. Others will find another sort of route towards maybe a broader sense of a deism where they don't think of a personal God, but maybe there's something else out there that's transcendent, or the idea of spirituality or souls or something else. Anything in that space that
I think
feels compelling to you?
I mean, this probably doesn't fit that, but I do have a tremendous respect for evolution, for systems that have evolved over millennia. And I just have respect for that, because I feel like it's very hubristic to try to think that we can intervene in that. And I feel like there's value in those systems just because they've evolved over such a long period of time. And then also in the last 5 or so years, I have started a meditation practice, and I guess, being more influenced by secular Buddhism. And so that isn't really spiritual or supernatural, but it is recognition that there is a whole lot we don't know as humans, and that there is more than just the material.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So overall, it feels like naturalistic in the way you think, critically minded, looking for evidence, but still, open-minded and humble, that you don't think we have all the answers, and a respect for, natural processes like evolution, just for, their sort of glory and wonder and what they've done over billions of years. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to the second big question. Often has a particular angle when talking to someone like you or me who doesn't have a religious worldview, because in a religious worldview, often the ethics come as part of the package. Who's in, who's out, punishments, rewards, rules to live by, and you and I don't have that. We don't have the Quran or the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or so on. So there's an obvious question. Okay, what does matter to you? And again, you can wind the clock back as far as you like to, what was your earliest thinking about good and bad, right and wrong, and how do you think of those things now, whether that's in a philosophical sense or a common sense way?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's really hard to articulate, because I feel like for as long as I can remember, I have had a very strong moral compass that is not based on any external, certainly not a religious document, also not like fear of punishment, the way that rules in our society are created, just like a deep sense of justice in my core, and a sense of what's right and wrong, and also a sense of needing to speak up about that. I mean, I'm generally a pretty shy person. I've experienced social anxiety, but there are times when something just bubbles up in me and I need to speak out about it, do something about it. And so I have this very driven conviction, and I can't really put my finger on the source of it, because I feel like it's just from me. And I like to believe that all humans have that in them. And I know I was just thinking, I was featured in Oprah's magazine about a decade ago. And it was a story about daring women reveal where they get their self-confidence. And they tagged me as the Crusader, was the title that they gave me.
Yeah.
But I think that was, in a way, it's just aligned with, like, I have this very strong conviction of what's right and wrong, and a need to speak up about it.
Yeah. And it's strong enough to override some shyness. And
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to dig into that a little bit, so justice seems to be something that's central to you. Is that justice something to do with fairness? Is it to do with avoiding harm? How does that feel to you? Is it more a sort of societal group level thing you think about, or is it more about individuals? How do you break justice down?
Yeah, it's a great question. Fairness is certainly a huge part of it. Not causing unnecessary suffering. And that word unnecessary is problematic because it's in our criminal cruelty laws, and it poses all kinds of problems. And it raises the question, what is necessary suffering? But, I do believe that some suffering is part of life and actually helps us grow. But, gratuitous and especially institutionalized cruelty to animals and non-human animals and humans alike is just fundamentally wrong in my viewpoint. I think it tends to, because I'm very pragmatic, it tends to come up in specific contexts involving particular individuals or particular practices that I'm challenging or industries. But I think it is all informed by an overlay of a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And, authoritarianism is wrong, not being transparent, harming others for profit. Those are some of the components of it for me.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a combination of there's fairness, there's avoiding needless harm. Your comment about authoritarianism, I guess, is something about liberty and freedom and wanting to, beings to have that too. Yeah, thank you. So, and the second question, which you've already started to answer, because it's very hard to split these things out, is who matters? So quite often in these conversations, we'll have a conversation about justice or avoiding needless suffering, and most of humanity would probably come along with us on that journey and say, yeah, I completely agree. These things are important and they're central to ethics. Where things differ is, okay, who gets to be considered when we're thinking about justice and suffering? So what's your journey been on that front? Again, from as early as you want to go back in terms of thinking about friends, family, the human race more broadly, and obviously that critical question about non-humans that might matter too.
Yeah, so I feel like I, for as long as I can remember, have had this intuitive sense about those things. But the time when I know that I started articulating it was when I was about 14. I had a traumatic experience. I had 2 pigs who I had raised from babies, bottle fed them, had them in my bedroom and then in the backyard. And this was not a 4-H situation. And they were unexpectedly slaughtered. And, I loved animals before that. That's why I had these pigs in our suburban house. But that really sent me on a journey to going to the library, which I'm grateful. I grew up going to the library and being able to learn about all of the things I wanted to learn about. And at that point, I just started reading about factory farming, animal rights, everything I could get my hands on. And one of the books that was very influential was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. I know you just had Peter Singer on. And so, it resonated with me very much that sentience matters. And that has been a fundamental touch point for me. I think I've added complications to it over the years. So I think one thing for me is I really like to take a precautionary principle. So if there's, if we don't have all the scientific evidence about a particular class of animals and whether or not they can feel suffering, I would just rather err on the side of caution. And also, I think there is value in systems, in addition, ecosystems that, going back to the evolution point, that have evolved to be interconnected over extraordinarily long periods of time. And so I think my focus tends to be on individuals and sentience, but that's overlaid with a respect for systems as well and interconnectedness.
Yeah, thank you. And if we go back to when you were a teenager, and that must have been an awful experience with pigs you shared your room and your home with. One thing is experiencing shock and sorrow for the beings you knew individually. Another thing is reading in the library about wider practices and systems and so on. And some people will still make those connections and still not draw it back to the systems we participate on a day-to-day basis as well. What was that process like for you? Because my guess is that even while you were sharing your home with pigs, your family probably were still eating animals. And
yeah, it's an interesting point because actually part of my mom's fundamentalism was that she didn't eat pork, and we didn't have pork in the house generally. My dad did, and when I would spend time with my dad, then I would get to eat bacon or hot dogs or whatever. And I loved eating meat and, didn't really think about the connection to animals. And so I think it was a huge wake up call for me. And I felt like I had been living a lie in a way, and that I had been betrayed, that there was all of this awfulness and corruption in the world that I had been totally unaware of. And it really led me to a path of just like thinking more critically about institutions across the board. And I, like, around that same time, I think probably because of the animal rights stuff, got into punk rock and then everything that comes with that. And so it made me much more distrustful of the world and of institutions and leadership. So that was like a big shift for me.
Yeah, it's pretty seismic. And it's in some of these conversations, it does feel like, it's not the same for you or me, but it does feel like there's sometimes a parallel between someone sort of waking up out of a religious worldview and waking up out of a more carnist way of thinking, because everything you thought was sort of normal and straightforward and well understood and accepted, you suddenly look at it with fresh eyes, and that can be a deeply shocking experience to go through. And there can sometimes be parallels between the two. And was that a difficult thing to work through, both psychologically, socially, with family? How did that process play out?
Yeah, absolutely. It's still playing out, right? Like, it'll be playing out for the rest of my life, I think. It was challenging. My mom, who was like a stay-at-home mom at that point and made all our food and we ate our meals together, was pretty, I think, resentful about it, and was like, I'm not going to make you separate food. Like, here, I'll set aside some plain rice for you. She has since come around, and she's been vegan for 15 or more than 15 years now, I think. So yeah, but there are uncles who always want to make a point of making fun of me. And my dad was the one who both got me the pigs and had them killed. And so that's still sort of an unresolved thing. It's evolving. Carol Adams wrote an amazing book, Living Among Meat Eaters, that I haven't read in years, but I recommend it to people sometimes when they're struggling with this, like trying to navigate a world that doesn't share their values. And particularly when you feel so deeply about it and it feels so fundamental to your identity. It's challenging, but I've learned to do it more easily over the years. And I feel like the world has gotten easier too. Like, it's gotten from a point where uncles, just to give an example, instead of making fun of me, will say like, oh, I tried the Beyond Burger and it wasn't that bad. So I think that's progress.
Yeah, it's progress. But it's a strange balance, isn't it? Because in a way, I guess, becoming vegan, thinking this way, feels for many people like a personal liberation. It's freeing. It's taking blinkers off. It's your eyes have been opened, and there's a sort of release in that. But that's balanced by the sense of shock you have when you look around friends, family, society as a whole, and the things they still pretend to think are normal. It's a strange thing, and that's a very difficult psychological journey for many people to work through. So yeah, Carol's book is a great recommendation for how to. You've got to recognize the reality of where society is, but still feel the imperative.
I didn't know any vegans, so
yeah, that makes such a big difference. That makes such a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the. I like to say that quite a few of my guests, not all of them are vegan, but nearly all, most of them are. They're quite weird people, and I mean that in the kindest possible way, because so many of them are the sort of people who, will have an experience, will do some thinking, and will actually change, even if it, crashes up against brutally imposed social norms. And that's a rare and wonderful thing. But those norms are changing too, as you say, they are changing. Yeah, we'll come back to that in the later questions. So you talked about sentience already. That's obviously one of the things that was central to Singer's work, and many other philosophers have referred to sentience, even if they disagree with Singer on utilitarianism. So many people will think about rights. as it grounded in sentience, or a care ethic is grounded in sentience as well. And that's, in a way, that's part of the way I've tried to frame sentientism as a worldview, is to say it actually can be quite neutral about which ethical system you apply, as long as every sentient being gets to matter somehow. I'm less worried about whether you apply a care ethic or a relational ethic or a deontological approach or a virtue ethics or a utilitarian approach, as long as every sentient being gets to matter, and as long as moral consideration and compassion retain their meanings, as in, being shown kindness, caring, compassion, not being needlessly harmed. Right? We need to keep those definitions robust as well. But so I focus on sentience as the grounding there. But you mentioned that you could go beyond. So there's a few different ways that sentience as a moral scope gets challenged. One is because people say, look, no, we should focus on humans, and they draw us back to anthropocentrism. You and I will clearly reject that. But there are people who go further. So people will go to a biocentric approach where non-sentient living things, and plants, I guess, is the classical example there, would matter because they're living. It doesn't matter if they're sentient. And then there's also an ecocentric or a holistic approach, which would say, well, actually, ecosystems themselves, including things within those environments that aren't even alive, matter intrinsically too. And so I think the first couple of times the word sentientism was used was to criticize it in that context. It was people saying, look, this is just another form of discrimination. What about the non-sentient stuff? And I'm pretty comfortable with that, because I think ultimately a sort of common sense grounding ethics is a concern for others. And what I mean by another is an entity with a perspective that can have things go well or badly for them. And that sort of is sentient. So it's sort of almost tautologically links back. So I'm quite comfortable with that. But you mentioned already that you do have broader concern for, ecosystems and interconnectedness of things as well. Is that an instrumental concern because those ecosystems are so important to the sentient beings? Or is that actually independent of that? If you'd imagine an ecosystem where there were no sentient beings at all, would you still think there's moral value in an ecosystem with no living or sentient things in it?
Wow, that's a good question. I've not pondered this. I don't know for sure. I have to think about it more, but I think it probably is instrumentalist. But it's hard because, I don't think you can separate out the sentient beings from the ecosystems, and
doing so in itself would harm them. Yes.
Right. And I think that it also goes back to this, just the sense that I have that it's so hubristic and human-centered to think that we know better than millions of years of evolution that have created these systems that work and can thrive. And so my concern is always focused on the individuals within those systems, but I'm not sure you can actually separate them out from the systems. I think, I wouldn't be in favor of taking animals out of the wild and putting them into captivity, even if it was in a way that we could somehow figure out a way to meet all of their needs. It just seems, and this does suggest that it's more instrumentalist. It's a fear of unintended consequences in fiddling with all of these years of evolution.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think I'm different sentences will answer this differently as well. But I think I'm in that same camp, in that ultimately everything in the end comes back to sentience for me. I just almost find it hard to explain how anything has value without ultimately coming back to either the aesthetic appreciation of a sentient being or the suffering or flourishing of a sentient being. But and I understand that people they're worried about granting only instrumental value to other things, because often that seems to mean I'm just going to viciously use that thing for my own, narrow ends. But I don't think it has to be that. I think instrumental concern can be deep and serious and humble, and recognizing those interconnections as well. So just because something's an instrumental concern doesn't mean it's not a very serious, rich one. And I think that's partly why I have so much healthy overlap between my sort of sentientist outlook and where, environmentalism is writ large, because the reason I care about the environment is because they're so richly important to all of the sentient beings that live in it, with however many quadrillion of us there are. But I guess my frustration sometimes is that I'm much more focused on making sure all the sentient beings get included than I am worried about people excluding non-sentient beings. And some people will I've spoken to many guests who said, look, I'm completely with you on sentientism. Every sentient being warrants our compassion, but they also want to go further. And I'm completely relaxed about that because all the sentient beings count. But unfortunately, there does seem to be a correlation within the modern environmental movement between people who express a really rich, generous, ecocentric concern, but conveniently exclude vast swathes of sentient beings living free-ranging and in our farms and in our labs and in our homes from their moral consideration. And that's my frustration, because to my mind, that just shows that their worldview isn't really genuinely ecocentric. It's just another veneer on anthropocentrism, because the reason they want the environment is because of ecosystem services, a nice comfortable temperature range, and frankly they like nature because it looks pretty.
Absolutely yeah.
That's partly why I'm very focused on inclusion of all the sentient beings and doing that seriously. But
yeah, no, I think that's completely right. And I think, so many of our environmental laws in the United States, for example, are really anthropocentric laws at the end of the day. I mean, the Endangered Species Act talks in its policy statements about the value that, these species could provide to humans. And so I am heartened by recent trends like rights of nature and things like that to shift from the human-centered care for the environment.
And I think that's one of the fascinating dynamics, because I do think there's a lot of positive changes going on in human culture and law and society. But there's, as part of that change, there's quite a lot of tokenistic crap as well, right? Where you'll see sentience being put into a law, or you'll be seeing animals, non-human animals, pop up more and more, or environmental stuff popping up more and more. But often it's still driven from a deeply anthropocentric assumption. And it's still better than nothing, and hopefully is a path to somewhere else. But we really have to keep a close eye on that stuff and not think the job is done before it's really finished. Yeah. So one other thing before we move off this who matters question is that even when we're thinking about sentient beings, there's plenty of space for challenge and debate there. One, as you've talked about already, is what's the boundary of sentience? And sentientism doesn't tell us the answer. It doesn't have a list of species. It just says, follow the science, which is always incomplete and always moving, but take a evidence and reason-based approach. And I think, as you suggested, a prudent approach where we give beings the benefit of the doubt and make sure we don't put the burden of proof on the wrong side, reasons that are convenient to us. So that's one. But there are also classes of sentient beings that are very contentious, even within the animal advocacy and the vegan movements as well. And you've hinted at one already, which is animals that are free-ranging, living in the wild, which vastly outnumber even those in our farms. And you could get even more, contentious in sci-fi and think about the potential for sentient artificial intelligences or alien species you might encounter as well. What do you think about those classes of sentient beings that go beyond the classic areas of concern of companion animals, lab animals, animals directly exploited and harmed by humans, farmed animals? What do you think about moral consideration for those other beings too?
Yeah, so I think, with regard to animals in the wild, I think they're absolutely due moral consideration, and particularly when human activities are going to impact them. So, some of the work that I've done over the years has been around importing trophies of animals killed in the wild in Africa, endangered rhinoceros, for example. And that is concern for the individual, certainly, but also the impact on the community of animals as a whole in having one of their members taken out. Similarly, Lolita or Tokite, an orca who I've advocated for many, many years, who's in captivity at the Miami Seaquarium. There's concern for her, but also her family, the critically endangered southern resident killer whale pod off the coast of Washington, and the role that she played and the impact on them of losing her. And she still reportedly, when played recordings of her pod's calls and their unique dialects, recognizes them. And so, particularly with social animals, it's a concern that extends beyond the individual. I think, certainly with insects, mollusks, things like that, I am, I feel like the science is increasingly clear. I know there was a study just out last week maybe about insects. So that's where the precautionary principle comes into me. Like it feels pretty clear to me that insects are sentient just from my observations. I mean, as a kid, I loved to like overturn rocks and watch bugs. AI, I don't know where I feel. That's something that I don't honestly spend a lot of time thinking about. And it sometimes feels like a bit of a distraction when we've got all of these currently existing sentient beings who we are actively inflicting suffering on. It seems distracting to be pondering. I know it's important and there are very real issues there, but it's not something I've come to my own position on.
Yeah, thank you. And to be honest, I feel the same because I do find it philosophically fascinating. I love, philosophy of mind and computation and what really is sentience and consciousness, and could it exist in a different substrate and so on. So I find that intellectually fascinating. But as a cause priority, when you compare it against quadrillions of directly suffering biological sentient beings that we're harming already, it doesn't compare. And I guess the part of the reason I do still talk about it is because I find it another chance to engage with a different academic community and a different, actually quite powerful, influential community who are all talking
Absolutely.
about artificial intelligence and its harms and existential risk and so on and so forth. And they love talking about, could these beings be sentient? So I quite enjoy engaging in those conversations because it then provides me with a chance to say, well, ultimately, if we do decide that these artificial beings might be sentient,
what about?
who cares? Yeah. If we already know farmed animals are sentient and it hasn't helped them, so what's the link? So in a way, it is a sort of cheeky chance for me to draw them back to the animal agenda. And I don't know what my results are like, but it's a useful way of engaging in what feels like a very different philosophical space, but just pointing out that very simple consistency that almost every human has that intuition and that intellectual knowledge that the capacity for sentience should qualify you as a moral patient, whatever you are, whoever you are. And don't we want to be consistent in our ethics? So it's just another chance to draw people back to that
I think
topic.
It's a brilliant strategy.
Yeah. And it's another area where it's frustrating because we see this all over the place, right? But it's much easier to condemn something that you're not part of. And it's much easier to stand up for a being that you're not hurting or that whose representation wouldn't require you to change. So it's really easy to say, I'm deeply compassionate for these potentially sentient AI. We should be really careful about not hurting them because it doesn't change what you have for lunch, right?
Absolutely.
So it's a sort of easy place for people to make that commitment, but then you draw them into something that actually requires them to change, and all of a sudden, it's not really the philosophy; it's just the implications and the social norms that get in the way.
100%. Yeah.
So this final question is, how can we make a better future? So assuming we share this sort of approach of trying to understand reality by using evidence and reason, we at the very least care about all the sentient beings. What do we do about it? How do we make a better future ultimately for all sentient kind? So it's too big a question, but I'd love to know whether you have a sort of big picture view about how to drive positive change, whether there's some utopian vision you think we might be able to get to. But of course, I'm also fascinated by the role you think animal law and education and various forms of advocacy might play in making a better world for us all. So you can go wherever you like on that crazily broad question.
This feels so obvious, but I think it bears saying. I think all humans matter. And one of the things that I've learned, particularly Elon and I have done some work around slaughterhouses and their extremely devastating impacts, not just on animals and the environment and consumers, but also workers in the slaughterhouses. And I've been pretty appalled by some feedback I've gotten on social media along the lines of like, who cares about those people? They're just causing harm. And these are people who are not choosing to do this work out of an array of options. They're some of our, most dispossessed members of society who don't have other options. And, I think there are times when people actually care more about non-human animals than certain humans. And that just shows how much work we have to do still. And I don't want the humans, particularly the most disenfranchised humans to be lost in all of these discussions. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's a deeply important point. And that's one of the reasons why I quite like focusing on this idea of sentience, because it's pretty obvious that all living humans are sentient beings too.
Right, yeah.
And there is that tendency within certain parts of the animal advocacy movement and, the vegan movements as well, that, and you can understand it to a degree, that, nominally they tend to focus on non-human animals and as the victims and as the targets and the beings we most want to help. And the harms caused by humanity writ large are so egregious and vicious and so easy to fix that can lead people into a sort of misanthropic perspective about humanity as a whole. And sometimes that's just a neglect question, right? We should just be about the non-human animals, and I'm not interested in the human animals. But it can even lead you into darker and darker places, whether you get into sort of eco-fascism or, seeing humans as the virus and so on and so forth. And again, I think that's a deeply flawed approach. Humans are sentient beings; they warrant serious moral consideration, and that's that, right? And you touched on another important point, which is it's easy to grant moral consideration and compassion to other humans that in our family and friends and people we like, but we need to grant moral consideration to even the people that we have fights with on Twitter, and even the people who are doing harm. And that doesn't mean we appease them or we show weakness or we allow that to continue needlessly, but they still warrant compassion, particularly if they're in the sorts of situations of the people you're talking about there, where they're frankly looking to keep their families' heads above water and have no other options, and are also in a particular epistemic and ethical context that gives them pretty little choice. And you can take that quite far into the topic of sort of moral luck, where ultimately everything, in a sense, is luck. So the whole idea of retributive blame is, to my mind, flawed. I mean, that's taking us a little bit further down a different direction. But regardless, that compassion has to be universal and unconditional. So, yeah, thank you that's an important point. Too often forgotten.
Yeah, thank you. So a better future, how can we make it happen? I think, some would say realist, some would say cynical. I don't have a vision of a utopia. I don't think we're going to reach some pinnacle where things will be set right. I think it's going to be an ongoing process of trial and error. And at the same time, I'm perhaps naively optimistic in that I do have tremendous faith and hope in humanity. And I do believe that humans, for the most part, care about animals. And when they learn what's happening to animals, particularly behind closed doors in institutionalized settings that so much effort has gone towards keeping them in the dark about, they will make changes, especially if they're supported in making those changes. And so I think, some of the things that inform my vision of a better future are more self-reflection for each of us, because we all are part of, it sounds trite, but we are part of the change, and we do need systems change, but systems change is not going to happen without changing ourselves. I'm reading Sean Ginwright's book, The Four Pivots, right now, subtitled Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves. And he really talks about how, this personal change is interconnected with systemic change. I think we need more recognition of our interconnectedness with other humans, with non-human animals, with the environment, and our laws, our culture approaches things in a very individualized, atomistic fashion, and it's not reflective of reality. And so it's easier to do it that way. And law likes bright lines, even if they're arbitrary. But reality is much more complex and messy. And I think we need to dive in and engage with that messiness. I think we individually need to strive to make more mindful choices. We need to try to ensure that people have access to accurate information to inform those choices. And I think some of that is where law comes into play. I do think law is very important in creating a better world for non-human animals and more generally, because law is the way that power is deployed in our society. And for too long, law has been used to facilitate the exploitation of non-human animals and also of many humans, workers, etc. And so it actively is facilitating that exploitation through things like subsidies, exemptions that say that it's not cruelty if it's done to a farmed animal, right to farm laws that say you can't sue a farm for negligence. And so, we need to start patching up all of those holes and breaks that have been extended to industrial animal agriculture, animal experimentation, etc., but also to shift things so that we are affirmatively supporting plant-based foods, just transitions where workers are getting what they need in order to transition from more exploitative industries. And so that's why I think law plays such a critical role. And that's why I'm focusing my time on training people to deploy the tool of law.
Thank you. No, that's a brilliant overview. And I share that sort of balance of frustration at the social norms and the institutions and the sort of mega structures of law and how much change that is required, with that optimism about the fact that, in a sense, I think most people, at least in theory, sort of already agree with this. Just this morning, there was a local sort of community WhatsApp group where a deer had been hit by a car and sadly died this morning. And the outpouring of grief and concern and compassion for that sentient being that these people had never met, apart from the person who was there on the spot, was spontaneous and genuine and rich. So that latent ethical sentiocentric concern is sort of already there for almost everybody. So that there's got to be some hope there. But yeah, those embedded systems and the social norms and the human psychology and the cognitive dissonance, and that's often where the challenge lies. And I sometimes feel that this sort of sentientism idea is, of course, it's a little bit naive because it suggests that if people just use evidence and reason and, like you said, have the transparency of facts and what is really going on, they knew the happy cow marketing wasn't true and they knew the reality and they granted moral consideration to sentient beings, then most of the problems would just be solved over time, right? It would just become a technical question of how do we get those things done, right? And it's just not that simple. I agree that the law can play a really powerful role in that. And I guess when I started this interview series, I probably had quite a naive view of how law might work. So a few of I think they're misconceptions. But one was I had the sense that the law probably generally followed public opinion and political will, and I'm not sure that's always the case. I also had a sort of simplistic view of the legal process of you just need to pass the law and then the problem is solved. Clearly breathtakingly naive. And I probably also neglected a lot of different types and levels of law, because as you've said, there's law that impacts individuals and companies and NGOs and corporates and governments and regional institutions, and you can go all the way up to international law and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the US Constitution. So anyway, that was a few of my sort of naive views about how the law would work. In terms of can it play a leading role or a lagging role? What's the process? And where do you think we've got the best chance of making real change through the law in that sort of massive governance mess we've got to work through?
Yeah, good question. And I don't think, maybe those are naive perspectives, but I certainly think they're common perspectives about the law. And I think part of it is just that we are not educated on how the law works and the role of law. And so I think, so the question about does law follow society or vice versa, that's such a messy question and there's no easy answer. It flows both ways. And what we do know is there is a vast gap between what people say in polling about how they think animals should be treated and what our laws actually require. And John Lovern, who runs the Law Ethics and Animals program at Yale Law School and also directs litigation for the Humane Society of the United States, he wrote a piece about 15 years ago talking about this. And so his recommendation was let's focus on that area, like the things where people already agree that we shouldn't be doing to animals, and get those codified. And some of like the anti-confinement bans, which the U.S. Supreme Court just upheld, were part of that work to, pretty much everyone, well, a majority of people at least, would agree that pigs should be allowed to stand up, lie down, turn around. So I think there is certainly work to be done in the space of what you could call the low-hanging fruit. But I also think law has a role to push and help evolve the social viewpoints. And so that's why I think that litigation that the Non-Human Rights Project, for example, is doing, that's really pushing the boundaries and forcing people to think outside of the box about how we should be treating animals, what the legal status of animals should be. And I really think we need to be trying all of those things. And I'm so grateful that animal law is such a growing field and a diverse field, and people are trying all of these different tools, because there is no silver bullet. Otherwise, we would have solved the problem already. I think in terms of, what you said before, which I think is also a common belief, like we passed a law and the issue's resolved. And passing a law in and of itself, even if purely symbolic, has value, partly because it's helping to codify these evolving social views. And I think it is really important to codify it so that it's not just a fleeting trend, it's actually, becoming part of our legal system. But, I've learned over the years how critically important enforcement is. So we've got all kinds of laws, including federal laws, the Animal Welfare Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, that are just not being enforced. And that's a massive problem. And in some ways, Justin Marceau at Denver Sturm College of Law has an article that he published in the last few years about how the Animal Welfare Act harms animals, because it creates this, he argues, it creates this view that there is this law protecting these animals. So people think they are protected when in fact there's not really meaningful protection. And so that's one of the things I really try to convey to students is you need to think about what the enforcement mechanisms are going to be. And that's why law training is helpful, because you can work your ass off to get a law passed, but if it doesn't have meaningful enforcement mechanisms, its value, while not nothing, is going to be limited.
Just on the enforcement thing, one area where the enforcement is really impressive is if you take a couple of very sick piglets from a farm, then you'll have a team of 8 FBI agents on your tail full time for months and months. So that's one space where the enforcement is really impressive.
Yeah. Much more priority on prosecuting those people than the animal abuses, partly because of all of the carve-outs in the law, but not entirely, because there are ways that we could be taking action under our current laws against factory farming practices. Yeah, and I think, so Denver Sturm College of Law has a clinic now focused on defending those activists. And I think that's a really important role that law can play as well. And then in terms of where to focus the efforts, because you're right, there's so many levels from the local to the international. And within each of those, there's like statutes and regulations and cases. And again, I don't think there's one right answer. I don't think there's a silver bullet. And so I really try to train students in each of those tools and the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And more often than not, they're complementary and you have to be thinking about their interaction. But I will say, I think perhaps the most progress for animals legally that's been made in the last decade or so has happened at the local level. I think there's a lot of opportunity at the local level, and that's something that like anybody can do. Go to your city council, get an ordinance passed. And so some of the work that I've been involved in has been around banning bullhooks, the weapons that are used to handle elephants who are used for entertainment, banning traveling wild animal acts, banning retail sales of pets. And that can then trickle up to the state level. We've seen that with both of those examples that's happened in some states, and then hopefully eventually federally. And I think now that we have the Supreme Court's decision and national pork producers, there may be some more opportunity to advocate for farm animals in that way as well.
Yeah, it's hopeful. And I agree, right? I think it can play a leading and a lagging role, and there's that two-way flow, but it's the same with all the different levels of governance as well. Often the local stuff is a bit easier to get traction on, and then it can ripple up remarkably quickly. And even strictly beyond the law itself, I really like approaches that people are taking at a very local level. So, the plant-based treaty is one really good example where you can get your local councillor to sign up, as well as your city, as well as a nation state. In the UK, there's been some interesting examples recently where people have been using planning regulations to stop new factory farms being built and so on. So, there are levers you can pull even at a very local level that can then have much broader ripples too. Yeah. And you also mentioned that given the sheer complexity, it's encouraging from the outset just to see how quickly the animal law field seems to have developed. I think I saw you say somewhere that even you've taught like 12 separate courses at 6 different law schools, and it just seems to be burgeoning and growing. And I have this sense that, it was a field that almost just didn't really exist before, to something that was then seen as a sort of minor niche, to something that is increasingly becoming more and more mainstream and just a core part of the law curriculum. How far do you think that can go? Because I'm quite often intellectually drawn to really purist, big picture, crazy top-down stuff where, for example, I talked to Michael Dorff about, could you imagine a future US Constitution that actually talked about, or Bill of Rights that talked about all sentient beings, not just humans and animals, and not just doing it separately? Or, I've had a go at rewriting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights and saying, look, it's not human, it's not non-human, it's all sentient beings. How far do you think we could go in terms of the law writ large, just intuitively and intrinsically abandoning anthropocentrism and taking non-human animals and other sentient beings seriously? Or is that just a bit pointless because there's so much real work to do in the meantime?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, again, I'm pretty cynical, and I think I don't see that happening during my lifetime. Could it happen down the line? I think potentially. And I think, especially the young people who are coming up doing this work give me tremendous hope. But there's so much money from the corporations and institutions that are profiting so extensively off of animal exploitation, and who the law has been helping for so long. And so I feel like we have just so much basic work to do in terms of dismantling all of those legal mechanisms that are facilitating exploitation of animals, forcing internalization of what have been externalized costs, including suffering, environmental harms. And it's partly because I am so pragmatic and I'm engaged on okay, what lawsuit can I bring today?
Yeah.
And how can I help animals today while also creating some precedent that we can then build on. But there are amazing scholars and others doing impact litigation that are theorizing okay, what are our legal frameworks for animals going to look like? And so I think that work is happening, and I do think we'll get to that point. But the U.S. is way behind the curve on that, and I think we will continue to be for some time, unfortunately, because of the tremendous way that corporations have, including in our democracy.
Yeah, I agree. It feels that way, and I like those sort of broader sort of big picture views. And one of the things we've been doing as a community is thinking about, if you took a sentientist worldview and just ran it through every field of human endeavor, what might it look like? And like you say, I've been doing it amateurishly, but there's some actual scholars who are doing real work thinking about what would economics look like if it took non-human animals seriously. One of my previous guests, Nicolas Trèche, doing some work on that in a conference in Paris at the moment, where they're explicitly thinking about animal welfare in the context of economics, or Sentientist Politics, which is actually the title of a book by Alistair Crane. And so, real people have been doing this stuff too. But you can think about animals in democracy, animals in law, obviously, animals in culture and entertainment, and how do all of these things shift if we take a much broader sentientist view. But I think it's a fair point that we shouldn't let that at the same time distract from the sheer volume of practical, real work that's got to be done. But it's quite interesting.
So we need all of it.
Yeah, and it's nice to have a big picture that you can imagine. Whether we'll get to that US Constitution for all sentient beings at some point, I don't know. We'll keep working on it. But you mentioned the US context as well, and I know that's your focus. How do you think this is playing out in different places around the world in the animal law space? Because there's also been some very helpful or promising shifts in places like India and in South America and other places where they seem to actually be maybe a little less trapped by some of the industry lobbyists and seem to have a little bit, more free thinking about some of the topics we're talking about. Do you get this sense that around the world there are other areas that might be leading the way more easily than the US?
Yeah, I mean, there are some like really astounding court decisions coming out in other countries that are, saying what seems obvious to animal advocates, but that I can't even imagine a court saying here in the US about animals' interests and prioritizing them. And, looking at those cases as they've been emerging over the last several years, like I always end up with my students in this, like, they're asking, why is the US so behind? Why are these other countries ahead? And it's hard to know because the legal systems are so different. And I also know that some of those decisions that have come out haven't actually translated into real change on the ground, sometimes even for the individual animal at issue, but also certainly for broader social change. So, in those countries where these decisions have come down, there's still like horrific things happening to animals, but they're ahead of us in terms of the discourse and recognition. And I hope that the U.S. our federal judiciary is increasingly conservative and already didn't really like looking to quote unquote international law or trends internationally. There's this sense that the U.S. is the best for some reason, which we
why look anywhere else when we're the best?
Yeah.
We have a bit of that here too, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I have to think that just in the same way that as more local governments and then more state governments are passing more animal protections, it's going to make it easier to pass them on the federal level. That as more countries, including countries that we are trading with, are enacting more protections, we're going to have to come to the table on these issues.
Yeah, and I think I'd be interested in your view about how realistic the prospects are, but there are already initiatives even at the UN level and at the European level, for example, and those sort of supranational governance organizations where people are trying to push essentially a sentientist agenda through those too and take animal interests more seriously. And, again, with some bottom up and maybe with a little bit of gentle top down, you could see these things connecting up.
Yeah. And then sometimes the response to that is like, but look at the state of human rights, for example, even though we do have international law ostensibly protecting that. But that doesn't mean it's not a reason to push for it. It's just to recognize that nothing is a cure-all, nothing is a silver bullet.
Yeah, there's no magic wand here, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't, set the stall out and keep pushing. Yeah. And I guess the final question before I let you escape is to come back to that topic you talked about before that you worked on with Elan as well, about these interconnected interests across ecosystems and human and non-human animals. How do you feel about that space? Because one of the challenges we'll get when we talk about non-human animals is, look, we've got enough problems with intrahuman ethics, within the States, around the world, in the UK, everywhere. Isn't that enough? How do you respond to that sort of challenge, whether it's a priority challenge or a focus?
Yeah, around the slaughterhouse issues specifically, I've just been blown away by the coalitions that have come together of people who weren't working together otherwise. Human worker advocacy groups, consumer protection, animal protection, environmental protection, and working together while acknowledging we each have different priorities, but that there's so much common ground has been incredibly powerful. And it's not easy. Coalition work in general, even just across with animal groups, is hard. But I think we can accomplish so much more when we work together, because the common enemy, the corporate industrial complex that is industrial animal agriculture, has so much power. And so I think we have to work together. And I hope that work that's been done can be a model and be built on. I also, again, am so heartened by young people, and perhaps I'm in a bubble being at Vermont Law and Graduate School, which is a very mission-driven institution, but I really feel like the students see the interconnections, and they recognize that the solutions therefore need to be interconnected. And so I think we will accomplish more. And that doesn't mean we have to sacrifice animals for workers, because it's very rare that there's like a direct conflict. Much more often than not, we have so much common ground and we can bring our power together.
Yeah, there are win-wins. And I think that idea of building coalitions of different groups to work together is so impactful, partly because practically you're probably much more likely to deliver a better outcome, but also because in doing that, those different groups, I think, can learn about the oppressions and the needless harms that each group are resisting, and come to a renewed appreciation for those things. And as you say, recognize that often the common drivers behind those, whether those are commercial or psychological or social, and ultimately all of those groups are resisting oppression, resisting needless harm, and trying to make a better world. And we might have different focuses within that, but writ large, there's got to be a common aim there. And I agree too, right? So often, particularly in the non-human animal space, when you look at the multifarious harms of the animal agriculture industry, the win-wins are just staring us in the face. There isn't even a trade-off to take, right? There isn't even a trade-off. We just need the political will and the individual will to carry these things through, with the answer is staring us in the face. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've really enjoyed learning a little bit more about your philosophical journey and your sort of guarded, cynical optimism about how we can make a better world. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation? And if not, how can people best follow you, learn more about your work, sign up to join you at Vermont?
I don't think I have anything to add. This has been great, very thought-provoking. I'm not really a philosopher, so it's been interesting to be pushed on some of these questions. Thank you. So I'd say the main place is vermontlaw.edu/animal law. And that's where folks can go to learn about the Animal Law and Policy Institute, including our degree programs, events that we have, a lot of online events, webinars and talks and things like that. And then for me individually, I am on various social media platforms. So I'm on Twitter, I'm at Delciana W, so it's my first name with 2 N's, and then my last initial. On Instagram, I'm at Prof Winders. I am also on LinkedIn. So those are some spots where folks can find me, but vermontlaw.edu/animal law is probably the best resource.
Thank you. No TikTok yet?
No, I keep pushing. I do think we need to be on there, but my bandwidth is limited, and I've yet to find someone to do TikTok for me. So
yeah, I look forward to that. Maybe next term. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. It's been a genuine pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for all of your amazing work too. So please stay in touch, and thank you for being a guest on Sentientist Conversations.
Thanks for having me.